Welcome to you all on this very special webinar with Dr. Roxy Manning. My name is Mark Williamson. I'm Director of Action for Happiness, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all from all around the world this evening for joining this event. And Roxy, it's lovely to be with you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark. I'm delighted to be here.
I know we're in other sides of the world, but I think what we're going to be talking about this evening is of universal significance in terms of our human relationships and how vital they are for our well-being. So I'll just give the audience a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about together. So Roxy and I will have a chat about deeper connections, this idea of cultivating more harmonious relationships and the principles of nonviolent communication, what they mean for us personally, but also what they mean for us collectively as communities and society as we face many global challenges. And then we're going to also do a few interactive things. Roxy's got some fabulous tips and ideas that we can put into practice. And also, of course, importantly, listen to your comments and responses and your questions. So please do, as many of you already are, feel free to use the chat to say hello, to share your responses, to support each other. And also the Q&A function, if you'd like to ask Roxy a question, please do feel free to do that. We won't have a chance to answer all of them, but I know Roxy's really keen to address lots of the different things that emerge on this vitally important topic. So welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. Lovely as always to see guests and people joining us from absolutely all around the world. Roxy, it's a crazy time in the world right now. In terms of how many of us are feeling. You're obviously in the US where there's some big things coming up in the political world. We're all facing this unusual global situation with COVID. And just on a general basis, humanity has always found relationships both utterly rewarding and increasingly challenging in many ways. I guess I wanted to start with a reflection on this sort of rather unusual situation we're in as a global family. Your reflections on it, given your expertise, you work obviously with people on relationships, putting nonviolent communication into practice. What are some of the things that you're seeing in your work and in your life at the moment?
So one of the things I'm noticing is that because there's so much going on, people are really overwhelmed. Like we might have the capacity to deal with stress in our families, and then we might have the capacity to deal with stress at work. But now we've added COVID, and we've added political unrest, and we've added, living here in the United States, I have to acknowledge how much what happens here impacts the rest of the world. So there's a lot of people anxiously waiting to see what happens with our elections. So there's so many different stressors piling up on top of each other that people are losing their capacity to hold more. And I find people are reporting feeling incredibly flooded and some cases going under, really struggling.
Yes, I think that's really interesting, isn't it? That it's often not necessarily any one particular event that sort of turns us over the edge in terms of stresses. It's just almost a compound effect of things in our personal lives, financial worries, health worries, relationship issues, and then big societal issues, worries about loved ones. And it all builds up to the point where I think many of us, myself included, over recent months have felt really like life is a bit out of control. And one of the lovely things I think about this recent situation has been, in some ways, how much we've been reminded about our innate need for connection, how important our relationships are, people returning back to time with families, realizing how much isolation and loneliness is a real challenge. I guess it sort of needs no introduction given your expertise, but how important would you say relationships are for our overall well-being?
Oh, I think they're so essential. I'm going to say two things about that. First, they're huge. When we're struggling, especially with all of these things that are outside of our control, being able to connect with the people that we love, to build those relationships, to deepen them, is one of the things that keeps us grounded. In some ways, it's part of what gives me this sense of purpose. I can manage or continue to stay in the fight. I can continue to show up, continue to support other people if I know it's benefiting the folks that are near to me, the folks in my heart. And when we have the capacity to broaden that circle of who we're holding close, we have the capacity to support our communities, to support our neighbors, like to keep going out and out, and to actually create more positive impacts in the world. So I think it's the one thing that keeps many of us saying, this is worth it. This is why I need to stay engaged, stay part of this.
Obviously, we know from the research that our well-being depends on our relationships. And later on, I'd like to come on to talk about some of these challenges we face about the polarization we're seeing in our world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Loyalties and in-group and out-group and our political divides and so on. But actually, all of our relationships have the potential for tension with our loved ones, our nearest and dearest. Some of those are the most complicated relationships. So your real expertise in nonviolent communication, I think, is invaluable. It's something that's had a big influence on my own life. I'd love it for all of our sakes, really, but especially for anyone who's not come across nonviolent communication before. If you could maybe explain the fundamental sort of story and idea behind it, and then we can think about how we might apply that in our lives.
Absolutely. So I love when you said that nonviolent communication has been helpful in your life, because it's also been incredibly helpful in mine. And one of the things that it brought to me was an invitation to start thinking more explicitly about what is my story about the world, right? What's my story about human beings, about how we relate to each other, and to question some of the stories that we learned. One of the stories that I learned, my family is an immigrant to the United States, and part of that immigrant experience is that you're often alone. All of a sudden, you've moved to a new world, and you're divorced from community, you're divorced from culture. And so there's this sense, one of our stories was, this is it. Our family is it. This is the only place we'll get support. You can't rely on anybody else. And this is a story that I hear is familiar over and over to folks who have this immigrant experience. While that story has a function that's really helpful, it helped us to continue to say, we're going to rely on each other, we're going to show up for each other, we're going to keep striving to do the things that will help us survive. It was also a story that was incredibly lonely, because it meant that the circle of who I could rely on was really small, and I didn't feel as safe when I ventured out into the world.
Yes.
That's one example of the kinds of stories that people hold about the world without thinking. Another story is that people are inherently evil, right? That people have this fundamentally flawed aspect that they need to be saved from themselves or from someone else. And so nonviolent communication, one of the ways I like to talk about it is that it's something that invites a different story. And it's a story that I find so amazing for its potential about creating the exact kind of connections between people and communities that you're talking about. It's one that says, whoever we are, wherever we live, whatever our life experience is, we all have the same basic fundamental needs. And these needs, the things that are important to us that we value, drive our behavior. So if somebody's doing something that I don't like, something that might even be harming me, I can start to be curious about, why are they doing that? What's driving their behavior? And if I can find out what that thing is, and especially if I can frame it in what they're doing is because they're valuing this thing, maybe they're valuing connection, maybe they're valuing respect, and I can get down to that core level of values, I can find that I also value the same thing. So then it's no longer about that person is bad or evil. It's around, wow, we're wanting the same things, and we need to find a different way to get what we're wanted that's not so costly for the other person. So it gives us a path towards connection that creates a lot of hope for me.
That's so powerful. I love what you said there. So I learnt about nonviolent communication through this lens of how to articulate
Mhm.
what might have traditionally been a sort of toxic interaction in a relationship, where I might have said something in a rather hostile way to defend my space or stand up for myself in some way, or to make a point, and to learn how to do that in a way that is less judgmental, is more aware of the dynamics of a relationship, and more able to articulate a need without it
Mhm.
having so much sort of blame and conflict associated with it. And I found that
Mhm.
really transformative. It made the way I communicate more about my expression of my own feelings and needs, and less about a critique of somebody else, and then allowing them to hear that
Yeah.
and respond to it. I know there are various different ways of putting that into practice. How do you find, as an expert in this, it's the best to sort of teach somebody the basics of nonviolent communication in practice?
Yeah. So for sure, I think really holding on to what are we trying to do when we think about nonviolent communication, which is I'm trying to connect. Fundamentally, that's what it's about. It's about creating connection between people. So I start by really making sure folks have that basic understanding of what the goal is. And then once I have that goal, like you just mentioned, many of us are used to having some pretty toxic ways of connecting, right? We've learned to defend ourselves, or we're not trusting the other person. And so we start to separate ourselves from them. So nonviolent communication has both the consciousness, but it also has a model for connection that can support us when we're trying to stay connected to that goal. I want to connect with this person. I'm noticing some constriction inside of myself. I can use this model, the communication model, to help me go back to this intention that this is just another person in front of me who's trying to take care of their needs.
Mm.
So,
So what is this model then? This sounds like it could be very helpful to us.
absolutely. So the model is actually incredibly simple. It has 4 parts. It's first, I need to understand what exactly is going on. What's happening? A lot of times we have our stories, our judgments, our interpretations about what's going on. But if we can slow it down and say, what did the person actually say? Not what did I think they meant, but what did they actually say, right? We get to the observation. So that's the first step. What's the observation? And once we understand that, we ask ourselves, what am I feeling about it, right? What's coming up for me? And really paying attention to our feelings, because our emotions can guide us to what's important to us. What is that need? What is that fundamental need that is up for me? And the last step, I know the observation, I know what I'm feeling about it, I know what my need is, what I value. And then I say, so if that's what's important to me, is there a request that I could make of myself or of another person that will help me attend to this need? So that's the first part, is I do those 4 steps. What's the observations, feeling, need, and my request for myself? And then this is a part that's incredibly powerful. I do it for the other person. I try to find out that other person in front of me is a human being. So they also might have a perspective about this that I'm not seeing. What's their observation? What might they be feeling and what's important to them? And once I connect to that, I get curious about what kind of requests might they have of me or of themselves. So those 4 steps, observations, feelings, needs, request, are a great way to start
That
practicing this.
that's brilliant. That's in line with the sort of way I learned it. So why don't you help coach me through a specific example then, Roxy?
Sure.
So I'm a great cyclist, as some in the community will know. I was cycling home this evening on a rather dark and wet evening, and as I was coming along on the road, a cyclist who's delivering some food, I think, sort of
Mhm.
jumped off the pavement in front of me without looking backwards, kind of in a dangerous movement. Kind of, I think it assumed there were no cars coming, and basically didn't see me and nearly caused an accident. And of course,
Mhm.
all the instinct in me was to go, "Oh, you effing idiot, get out," and to respond, because I felt, if I tuning into what's going on, at one level it was, I'm in danger, I felt scared, I need to show this person that was not acceptable behavior. But
Mhm.
trying to sort of step back and think, what would an observations, feelings, needs, request way of responding to that have been? To see the other human. I mean, I guess
Mhm.
I hadn't thought about this at the time, but here's somebody trying to earn a living on a bike,
Mhm.
delivering, probably trying to in a rush to get somewhere, probably under
Mhm.
pressure to get food delivered quickly, may not have had much training about how to cycle safely. So I can sort of begin to see, okay, so there may be a reason why they've done what they've done that isn't malicious.
Mhm.
Feelings, I mean, I was feeling scared, and I felt like I wanted to let this person know that I had a need to be like, have my safety respected, and that I don't want them to do that again. And so I don't think I made the request very well, but as I went past, I said, please be careful, was my sort of articulation of
Lovely.
that. And I found that
Mhm.
careful is quite a good word to use in those difficult transport examples, because it becomes less blameful and more about an encouraging, sort of a kind approach to each other.
Yeah.
But so how can you help me in that kind of situation? That's obviously just a
Yeah.
one-off, but it's
Mhm.
difficult when we have these moments, because in that moment I was really angry and scared.
Absolutely. And I love what you actually just outlined, right? So the first step is noticing what happened in that moment. This guy just jumped in front of me and I might have crashed into him. So noticing both that this event happened and also the rush of adrenaline that you felt, right?
Yeah.
It wasn't just the jumping in front of you, it was the braking, all of the stuff that happened in your body. And paying attention to that feeling. It's really easy to say, I feel angry, and to stop there. But if you went one step below, I feel angry because I feel scared, right?
Mm.
So getting down to that lower, more vulnerable feeling is part of what makes that connection a little bit easier. And then I might ask you, okay, and you named this already, when you noticed that you were feeling scared as this guy jumped in front of you, what was the most important thing to you in that moment that was driving that fear?
Um, well, I think there's an immediate survival instinct, but a thing I found myself wanting to say to him was, I'm on my way home to see my wife and children. There were
Yeah.
other people's lives at stake here. If I don't make it back because he's knocked me in front of a car, it's not just me that's affected by it. It's sort of, I'm not sure it was quite that clear in my head at the time, but there was a sense of, there were lives at stake when you do something dangerous. And that made me
Absolutely. So
feel
wanting,
scared for myself and scared for loved ones as well.
yeah, so wanting some shared awareness for everyone on the road that all of our actions will impact not just you, but also the people that you might hurt, and
Exactly.
also ripple out and affect all of these folks that you really care about. So some shared awareness of the impact of the kinds of actions that we take.
Mm.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's
Oh.
really good coaching. I now feel better equipped to respond compassionately while cycling. But of
Well,
course,
I'd want to do a little bit more
yeah,
though.
please.
Hold on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So once we have that shared awareness, there are a couple of options that you have here. And I heard that one option you took was I have the request as I'm going by him. I said, please be careful, right? So that's a request that's attending to letting that one person know, hey, you might have had an impact. I want you to be careful. Think about everyone else out there. But there are other things that are important to you also. I wonder what request you would make of yourself in that situation, knowing how important it was for you to get home to your family, to be safe, and that you're biking in the dark. Is there anything that you would want to change about your behavior going forward, knowing that this could happen again?
Well, I think these events are always a reminder of how precious life is and how much, just traveling
Mhm.
around London on a bike is a risk. And I owe it to not just myself, but to other people who care about me to do that as safely and conscientiously as possible. And maybe with hindsight, I could have seen that was a cyclist emerging out of the peripheral vision and slowed down and be more aware of the fact that this was a risk, So there's something about me cultivating a more of a spirit of, safety, but because of my concern for my relationships, not just for my own safety, if you like.
Absolutely. Yes. So being aware, like in that moment, once you're really connected to, I'm holding not just my safety, but the impact on family, one request for yourself is I want to be more mindful. I want to track intersections as I'm approaching them and maybe slow
Yeah,
down a little bit, right? Yeah.
really good. I've just noticed a comment or a question indeed from Gabby in the chat here
Mhm.
saying, what's the difference between the need and the request in this model?
Absolutely. So the need is the thing that's fundamentally core, like something that I deeply value. So in this scenario that you're talking about, you're valuing sanctity of life, really. That's
Yeah.
at the very bottom, the sanctity of life and the possibility of relationships continuing. Once I know what those needs are, the requests are what are the strategies, what are the things I could do that would help me assure that need would be met. So the strategy would be asking this guy to be careful, asking yourself to be mindful as you approach intersections, possibly even advocating for rules around bike laws, like laws around bike lanes and things like that, that would
Mm.
help support biking safely in the city.
Yeah, great. That's a lovely, because that links the sort of personal change to the social activism, which I'd like us to talk a bit more about later on. Thank you. But before we move on, Roxy, that's been a really helpful example, certainly for me personally, but I can see that some people in the chat have also appreciated that being brought to life. But of course, we are creatures of habit. And although we can rehearse this in principle, it's sometimes in the heat of the moment when we're feeling angry, we're feeling frightened, we're feeling ignored, that it's harder to put this into practice. I often find that I feel a little bit upset with myself afterwards that I maybe overreacted or I wasn't very
Mhm.
compassionate and so on. Have you got any sort of tips or practices we could use to help us build these habits in a more lasting way?
Absolutely. So the first piece is like what you just described, you're not alone with, right? So we all have these kind of impulsive or instinctual reactions when we feel threatened, when we feel scared. And I would start off by saying, be compassionate with yourself. Like acknowledge, like, wow, I did not show up in the way that I would like. And then the thing that I like to do is something that I call the post-rehearsal, which is different than a rehearsal. Rehearsals are what I might do thinking, I'm going into this challenging conversation. Let me kind of play out how it might fold and plan what I'm going to say. A post-rehearsal is what happens after post that challenging conversation, when you're like, I did not show up in the way that I like, so now I can stop. I love that Margarita said, take a breath in. And then when I have more spaciousness, when I'm by myself, I can go back and say, okay, in that moment, what was the thing that triggered me, that got me upset? What was that observation? What was I needing in that moment? What were my needs? What were my feelings? And then what would I do differently next time? What request could I make for myself? I like to tell people that we have had a lifetime of learning one way of communicating, one like really taking in the story about the world and about how people are, right? Some stories that people have are people don't really care about me. People are selfish. So we have a lifetime of reacting to that story. So we want to give ourselves ample opportunities to practice a new story. So the more that you do these post rehearsals, the more you're giving your brain an experience that, wow, those conversations can go differently.
That's so great. I love, and Andrea has just said in the comments, I call that a PMA, post-match analysis.
Beautiful,
using a,
beautiful.
using a sporting analogy. I love that because instead of being a sort of beating yourself up for having got it wrong, here's a learning opportunity. I can revisit what happened and then build a kind of path towards, better or different habits in future. So I think that's really powerful. So seeing it in
Yeah.
a constructive learning way rather than a sort of berating way. That's very, very
Right. And
good.
the more that you do that, the more available this new way is to you the next time this happens. Right. So that if I've practiced it, then the last thing in my brain is not what went wrong, but wow, here's what went right. And then I have it at my fingertips when that conversation happens again.
Mm, thank you. Now, one of the things that struck me both about that example that we talked about of mine and also just more generally is about the importance of listening as well as understanding our own needs. And of course, I didn't really have the chance in that interaction with another cyclist to really hear them. And maybe in a conversation in a different situation, it's easier. But I remember when I first learned the art of active listening and really trying to tune into what someone's really saying rather than thinking about what I'm going to say next or how I might disagree with them and all the other stuff we do, checking
Mhm.
your phone and all the rest of it. I'd love to hear your thoughts on listening and how we can be better listeners and how important that is.
Yeah. So nonviolent communication has been really helpful for me in this area. One way is that it makes a lot of sense. Like you said, if I can just stay focused, not distracted by all of the other things that life gives us, but just stay focused on the person in front of me, I also bring to it, what is this person needing? What are they needing? They're speaking to me, they're telling me things. What are they feeling and what they're needing? And if I just focus on answering those two questions, and if I don't know the answer from what they're saying, ask questions to get that information. Make guesses about what's going on for them to get that information before I respond, before I react. Make sure that I not only understand what's important to them, but I've checked that out with them. What I'm getting, Mark, is that you're saying that in this moment, safety was really important to you. Am I right? And once I've got that, yes, you've got me, I've slowed down that conversation. We're no longer in that rapid fire rebuttal, speak and rebut kind of pattern. We're now in the taking in, receiving the person's experience, and then noticing what's coming up for me that I want to have heard. And I think that is so important around listening, making sure I've really gotten what's important, what the other person values.
I'm smiling, Roxy, because I remember the first time somebody introduced me to this some years back now, and I thought this idea of sort of replaying to someone what they've said it felt a bit false and awkward. And I tried it with my wife that evening, expecting that she'd sort of laugh at me, and I just sort of repeated back what I thought she said. And at the end of this, what felt to me quite awkward interaction, she said, "Oh, it's been really nice talking this evening." And I thought, "Oh my goodness, that's a different reaction to what I normally get." And there's definitely
Mhm.
something in that certainly didn't come naturally to me. That idea to just all I'm trying to do is let you know you've been heard and check that I've understood you. And that seems to me that in many ways it's entirely what's missing in our political conversations and our disagreements and our misunderstandings of different groups and our culture wars, that we're not really hearing each other actually.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of it, that when I don't feel heard, I have to up the ante. It's like if I've told you, here's what's important to me, and you don't hear me, all I'm hearing is what's important to you, I'm going to do something to make you hear me. So it might be that my rhetoric gets more divisive, or I start taking actions that are really painful. And so the more that we can slow it down and first make sure that folks are heard, the more likely it is that the conversation stays productive.
Mm. And I think this is particularly important for our nearest and dearest relationships and our families and partners and so on. I wondered, I think you may have some practices that we could learn about of how, ways we can get better at listening or at least put more focus into our listening. Is there anything you'd recommend?
Yeah. So, especially because so many of us are now home a lot more hours than we'd ever been with our loved ones,
Yeah.
Like I know people started off going, this is amazing. I get to spend time with them. And now that the tension's been building, one of the places we've been experiencing stress is like we're actually taking out on the very people that we love. And so Many families are finding so many decisions that they have to make, so many challenges coming up, even disagreements around like what's happening politically in the world. So I recommend that you start to slow it down. Just think about slowing it down. And one really simple way to do that is what I call 10 and 10. So agree that for whatever contentious topic that you really want to hear each other about, have one person go. And so tonight I might say, darling, I'd love to hear what you're thinking about our decision to send our kid back to school in person, right? This is a decision that a lot of families are
Yeah.
struggling with. And so what I'm going to agree to is for the next 10 minutes, I just want you to tell me what's important to you about this, what you'd want me to know. And I'm only going to reflect back what I hear is important to you. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to defend myself. You've got 10 minutes, just speak. And I'm going to reflect it back to you until you know that you've been heard. And then the conversation ends. And that way, everyone has time not only to be heard, but then we can integrate. My partner can integrate. Have I really said everything that's important to me? They really get it. And I can take in, like, okay, this is what was important to them, and let that resonate inside of me. And then the next night, we have the conversation, but now it's my turn to speak. I get to speak for 10 minutes and they get to reflect back what's important to me. And now we've slowed the conversation way down so that we can really hear each other. And part of the result is we're not just hearing each other, we're understanding each other.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And of course, once we can hear each other, we have the potential to reflect and repair and revisit. And there's a lovely comment I saw from Anna on the chat a bit earlier on when we were talking about sort of the post-match analysis. I'm not quite sure if it's a quote or her own writing, but she said, it's not what you say, it's what you say after you've said, not what you do, but what you do after you've done. It's about repairing and making amends. So I think that we may respond in a sort of rather harsh or instinctive way in the moment, but we still always have that chance to listen and repair and apologize and review. And again, another contributor, Margarita, said, if you do one of these post-rehearsals with your partner together, it's a great opportunity to enrich your relationship. So I think both listening and revisiting perhaps difficult moments might be another good thing.
And I'd want to add that I've often found that when people start to really do the 10 and 10, what they often find, even when conflicts are really intense, is that they want the same things. They have different strategies around how they get that thing, but it's like, I actually want safety and I want safety, but it looks differently. And it's like, once I realize that we're wanting the exact same things, it actually becomes a lot easier to come up with a strategy that's going to work for both of us. But we need to first understand that we're not actually arguing about what's important. We're just arguing about how to get it.
Yes, and of course, what many of us are really after behind everything is just to feel loved and accepted, and that shows itself in different ways. And that may be about feeling like we're in control. It may be about feeling like we're getting praised and recognized for what we do. But at the end of the day, we all just want to feel, connected, and that's why I think your work is so important. Let's turn, Roxy, to some of the broader issues that are, I think, related very much to the interpersonal stuff we've already been talking about. But of course, there is what feels like an increasing amount of division and polarization in our world. We look at some of the political change, we look at some of the disagreements, we look at some of the conflicts, and we look at even some of the responses to the current health crisis. There's a real sense of us versus them being a strong human drive. I guess it was ever thus because back in the savannah, our ancestors probably would have had a tribal loyalty, and there's something really powerful about being in the in-group and having others that you want to protect and defend and be together with. And when there's an in-group, there's perhaps inherently an out-group. But yet it feels to me there's also another side of our nature, which is about shared humanity and, as you said earlier, all having the same basic needs. So perhaps before we turn to any specific examples, are there some general principles for how we can create more of that sense of common humanity and less of the us versus them?
Yeah, in some ways, I think that that's exactly what NVC is pointing to, that even when there's a group that seems to be wanting something very differently than I do, if I can start to ask myself, why do they want that? Why are they advocating for this bit of legislation? And if we're starting to go from families to the larger society structures, it's to recognize that a lot of these divisions are not because my group is different than your group or we want something, but because there's a problem in how our world is dividing up resources. We've put some artificial constraints around who gets to access what resources, and we tell folks, you guys argue about this little bit instead of looking at the bigger picture. And I think once we start to recognize, okay, you're wanting water rights and you're wanting, like in the United States, there have been a couple of really major Supreme Court decisions that are just about the rights to access water. Some rivers that are going to between two states, which states gets access to the water right? And it's, in my mind, almost mind-boggling. Of course, everyone should have access to the water rights. So the question isn't really, should it be yours or should it be mine? It's how can we find a solution where we all get the benefit from this resource? And I think that's what we need to do. We need to understand what's motivating the actions of any group that we see um, arguing for something that's different than what we want, and how can we find a strategy that's going to work for us and for them. So just always remembering to expand who's going to benefit from any strategy that I'm pointing to. I don't want it to benefit just mine. I want it to truly work and have less impact for everyone else also.
And that underlying need for sort of fairness in some way is behind some of what might be seen as polarization. And I think this is why it's important we move towards what we might call positive sum games, where we benefit together, rather than the sort of zero sum games where if I win you lose, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But
and I want to quickly add, Mark,
sure,
that's actually one of those stories, right? One of the stories that so much of the world has been operating under is that it is a zero sum game. If I win, you lose, but if you win, I lose. And when I have that story, it's really hard to trust that we can come up with a strategy that works together. And instead, a friend of mine, Mickey Kashtan, calls it, what we're really struggling with is a crisis of imagination. If we understand the needs that I have and the needs that you have, the only problem we have is a lack of imagination on how to attend to both sets of needs.
I'm reminded of the fact that somebody once told me that in difficult negotiations between, for example, warring tribes or any kind of conflict resolution, that one of the best techniques is to ask one party to try and articulate the other party's perspective in their own words. And then see if they've understood it. And I wonder if that's something we can apply more. It feels to me that, when in the UK people were frustrated about the Brexit vote or on different sides of that debate, or people in the US are frustrated about the partisan divide there, that we miss a chance sometimes to try and understand where the other person's coming from and why it might be a perfectly rational thing to have voted or responded in that way, given your own perspective, background, history, family, and so on. And I think there's that... It's something about the art of being able to disagree whilst also maintaining respect for someone else and the fact that they might have a valid reason for having that opinion. I feel that social media isn't helping our ability to disagree nicely. And what's your thoughts on that?
Oh, goodness gracious, absolutely. Because social media, not only have we made it so that people are just responding quickly without stopping to reflect on what I'm responding. It's just I see something, I pay attention to what sparks inside of me, and then I respond. Rather than if somebody was in front of me and I could see them, I would have a different way of engaging with them. I would want to wait to notice, like, not just the words that they wrote, but what was their body language when they said that, right? Where's this coming from? We lose a lot of information on social media. And so on social media, I would say slow down even more. You can take that 10 and 10 concept and apply it to social media. Before you give your opinion, reflect back what you think is important to the other person. Ask them, when you wrote this, when you wrote, Trump is the best thing for economics, right? Is it what you really meant to say is that you're really scared that you're not trusting current governments to really attend to folks who are going to lose their livelihoods and be able to sustain their families? Is that what you're wanting us to hear? And once they say yes, then I know what I'm responding to. I don't get caught into responding to the question about Trump. I get caught into connecting around how terrifying it is to not know that I'm going to be able to feed my family.
It's back to feeling the needs again, isn't it, really?
Exactly, truly.
Yeah, thank you. So obviously one of the biggest sort of social issues of our time is around systemic racism and the Black Lives Matter protests that have been triggered in the US and indeed all around the world. And there were all kinds of questions that come up for me around that, which I'd love your insight on. But one of them is a question about how do we push for social change in a constructive way? I think it's absolutely remarkable how many people have stood up for this utterly vital cause in a really sort of culture shifting way. And I ask, as a white man in a middle class British environment, I've had a huge wake up call recently to just recognizing the amount of prejudice, both conscious and unconscious, and bias that is built into systems all around us that affects, fellow citizens of mine from different ethnic backgrounds in a way that I was just utterly blind to. And that's been a real awakening for me. And I'm really grateful to this movement having shaken me up and many others like me. But of course, there's always a tension when we're pushing for social change of like galvanizing that waking up moment, but also doing it in a way that creates positive change rather than more conflict. What's your sense of how we can respond to our desire to make things better in the most constructive way that brings people with us?
Wow, this is a really big question. And I
Yeah,
would want to talk about two different possibilities. So you started to frame this around your experience as, a middle-class white man. And when I hear that, what I'm hearing is, how can I show up and be an ally
yeah,
and really support change in the world? And I think part of it is showing up and assuming that a lot of the things that I've experienced, a lot of the understanding I have about how the world works is incredibly constrained.
mm,
And when I see people showing up and advocating for something different or naming that there is a problem, I don't say, what are you talking about? I say, tell me more, right? So if all I do is to say, tell me more, bringing in that commitment to listening, deep listening, that's one of the ways that we can start making sure that we're open to the dialogue that needs to happen. So tell me more. Another thing that I would do from the ally perspective is asking, what requests do you have of me? A lot of people, so, again, that NVC component is requests. A lot of people, again, situated in their perspective, say, I know what you need. I know what we need to do, rather than saying, let me listen to what you think is necessary. Let me listen to what your needs are. And it might be that the thing you're asking for might not work for me, but I'm going to offer then what I can do that might help meet your needs. So really being focused on showing up and listening to things that might be different than mine and asking, how can I help you? What actions can I take that would support you in meeting the needs that you're identifying for yourself? So
that's
that's one
really
piece. Now,
helpful. Yeah, thank you, Roxy, because that's again a lovely example of putting the non-violent communication principles into practice, but this time not in a sort of close personal relationship, in a sense of a relationship to a societal issue and a whole kind of complex nest of relationships we have in our society, and the fact that we so often just are blind to what others' experiences are, and we sort of, as committed citizens wanting a happier world, tuning into what's going on for others should be part of our way of being.
absolutely. And so then I would say that the second part, right, is I'm a Black woman. I'm growing up in the United States. And so I intimately know some of the things that people are challenging, some of the reasons why we're having so many protests.
Mm,
And I would say that this question, one of the questions that comes up is, but there's a right way to protest, right? We should be protesting with words or maybe marching, but not with violence. And I want to invite folks, when you have that sense of the right way to protest, to again bring this empathic lens, the sense of connecting to feelings and needs that NVC is bringing. I ask observers, instead of necessarily judging people about the way that they're protesting, ask yourself, why would somebody need to protest in this way? And a lot of times it's around that kind of hopelessness that we talked about earlier. I've been protesting all my life around, hey, there's a lot of injustice here, and y'all haven't listened. And if this is the only way I can get people to stand up and pay attention is by violence, sometimes people feel hopeless. So it's around bringing empathy and understanding to why folks are doing this rather
mm,
than immediately condemning it. Because when we immediately condemn it, we contribute to the practice of we're negating the message that they're trying to bring. And instead, I would say, let me hear your message and ask you for a different strategy.
mm,
But let me hear the message and reflect it back to you. The other piece, then, I would say, is my personal stance is I choose not to engage in violence. And the reason why is not because, again, I'm condemning one way or another. It's around, I want to be effective in my actions. And like the work of Kristen Chenoweth, there are a number of people who say nonviolence is more effective than violence. And the way that I make sense of that is that when I'm not violent, the person who's listening to me is actually able to pay attention to my message. The other needs that come up for them around violence, around their safety, around their sense of having to protect something that's important to them, that goes away to some degree, and they're much more available to actually hear my message and engage with me when I'm not doing violent actions. So it's around what's the most effective way for me to get my message across rather than a blanket condemnation of different ways of doing that.
It's so powerful, Roxy. Thank you for sharing that. And it seems to me grounded in just empathy for the fact that people are coming from different situations, and that they're often, yeah, the best way to approach these things is to start with what's the fundamental human need and what's the best way of articulating that so you can be heard and you can listen to others as well. So again, it seems to come back to all these principles you've been sharing with us this evening. Now, we've had lots of great questions coming up, so I'd like to come to those in a moment. Were you going to add something else on this? We'll move on.
Yeah, I want to add one more thing. The other piece that's really important to me whenever we talk about that level of social change is to remind people that there's a difference between being nice, which is not what I'm advocating, and being nonviolent, right? So we can be incredibly motivated and inspired by the words of Gandhi and King and all of the folks who have been nonviolent throughout generations. I'm going to show up. I'm going to talk and speak the hard truths, but I'm going to do it in a way that makes it really clear that this is not about demonizing you and putting you down, but around letting you know, here are the needs that are not being met with me, with the current systems, the current strategies that society is engaging in. Pay attention to my suffering and my pain. And so I want folks to remember that change is active. It's an active, hard, difficult process. It requires naming things that people don't want to hear, and we need to persist in that.
Thank you. I think that's a really good place to move into these great questions that have been sharing, because I'd love to get to those. Just one has just popped up on the chat. Kate's just asked, how do you go about creating new meaningful connections when you can't meet someone in person? I think this is so topical right now when we're doing a lot of this in person, but on sort of face to face, but on screen rather than in the room. And you sort of, we know that the body language and the kind of proximity does matter in our relationships. What can you do to help there?
So I'm reminded, like, I guess I'm of the generation where I started off with pen pals, and then I started off with those internet chat boxes. And one of the people that I remember having an amazing connection with lived in Norway. I have never met this person, but for about 2 years, we had this incredibly deep sense of supporting each other as we struggled with different things in our lives. And it's around the same thing, that the way that I create these connections is that I show up. And that's important. I keep showing up. I don't let everything in life overwhelm me so much that I drop attending to the connections that matter to me. So show up. And when I show up, make sure that I really listen to the person. I create space where we're not talking about the unimportant things, right? It's not, how are you today? But it's like, so tell me, what's mattering to you today? What's something you're struggling with? Ask the questions that invite people to go to this deep, intimate place. And then, really important, listen. We're so used to giving advice. It's like someone tells you something and we immediately love giving advice to them. Here's what you do. What people really want is to be heard. When people are deeply heard, when they're supported and connecting to what matters to them, they often know exactly what they need to do. So just listen, reflect back what's important to them, and it makes such a difference. Those connections are deep.
Thank you. So there's a couple of things that have come up on a similar theme, which, you know, whilst what you've said sounds incredibly applicable, someone here, an anonymous questioner, as I said, can you apply this also with toxic people or toxic relationships? Is there a point where we should just stop trying and recede? And then I'm reminded of something that somebody shared on Twitter the other day in response to us mentioning nonviolent communication. They said, this is great, but I have to mention that nonviolent communication only works in healthy relationships. You cannot nonviolent communicate your way out of a toxic or abusive relationship. What are your thoughts on that?
So it's a couple of things. Nonviolent communication for me has two avenues that I can go. One avenue is about that connection with the other person, but the other is about my connection to myself. So when I think about, quote, toxic relationships, part of what I tell myself is, I don't have the resources to show up for this person in the way that they're needing. So somebody who, for instance, one of the ways that people are judged are, quote, being borderline or narcissistic, having this intense focus on their needs at the expense of my needs. And what that means, if somebody continuously shows up in a relationship this way, means I'm going to have to track my needs and I'm going to have to advocate for my needs in that relationship. And if I find that I can't with that person, it is okay to say to myself, I don't have the skills right now. And I'm going to end this relationship because I don't trust that I can show up in a way that holds care for myself. It's incredibly different than saying this is a toxic relationship and that person is bad. It's just saying I'm doing self-care. And when I feel that I have the capacity, the space, the time, the energy, and the skill to engage with this person, I can go back and be in relationship with that person. But I'm acknowledging the limits of my capacity if the relationship is not open to anything that I could bring with my nonviolent communication skills or anything else I bring to relationships.
Mm. Thank you. Now, Matt has asked what I think is a very self-aware question, which I'm grateful for. He says, I often find myself wanting to prove others wrong. What is my need in that instance, and is it valid?
I'm guessing that at the base, one need is shared reality, right? If I'm proving somebody wrong, it's saying that I really have this sense of the world and I want you to like understand it and get it. And whatever's going on for you, we don't have shared reality about it. But another piece is around predictability. It's like if somebody's coming with a whole worldview that's different than mine, all of a sudden there's a shakiness to my world. I have to question what I've believed. And that is really hard. That is so scary to have a sense that everything I've been reacting to is no longer true. And so it becomes really easy to just say, I'm going to make them wrong and reduce the amount of activation and fear that I would have to live with if I entertained the idea that they could be right. And so just invite yourself, how much uncertainty can you live with if you are opening your mind to saying, what's going on with this person? Why do they believe something so different than me? And if you don't have the capacity to live with that uncertainty, acknowledge it as, again, your limitation rather than their problem.
Mm. Just before we move on to the next question, I've just seen a couple of people asking about whether they can have access to the video from this event or the chat text. So yes, folks, we will circulate a link to the conversation, both the video and the chat afterwards, if you want to follow up on anything you've heard or seen or watch it again. Roxy, Tasha has asked, or made a really interesting observation. She said she feels comfortable thinking through and understanding the needs of herself and others in conflict, but really struggles making requests. She says, so I often leave my needs and grievances unexpressed. Do you have any advice on how to have the confidence to communicate these needs?
Absolutely. I love that question. One of the challenges is that so many of us have had our requests received with a lot of pushback or judgment or messages, you're too needy, there's something wrong with you for wanting this. And because of that, we have a strong attachment, like, I want this now. And it feels so scary. We tell ourselves, if they say no to this request, they're saying no to me. I don't matter. There's something wrong with me. And so it's first being able to separate out those two things, the request that I'm asking for and the need I'm attempting to meet, and whether or not I have value. I can have somebody say no to my request and still have a sense that they value me, value my relationship. So that's the first piece. The second piece, I find it a lot easier to make requests when I'm really clear about identifying the need that I'm trying to meet. And then I think of 3 different ways to meet that need. So if I have 3 different strategies, then I might make that request of you, knowing that if you say no, I've got 2 other options. It's no longer so high stakes when I make that one request because everything's not riding on it. So come up with at least 3 ways to meet that need and then make that request.
And thank you. And on a related note, Becca's sort of made a point about asking questions of people. How do you do it so you don't sound like an investigator? I think I always remember I had a close friend when I was studying abroad once. He was Indian and I was coming from obviously an English background. And we had this strange realization in our relationship that he came from a culture where the polite thing to do was to tell people about yourself and then wait to be asked. And then not ask people about themselves. And I came from a culture where it was like, I wanted to ask about them, but not say too much about myself until somebody asked me. And as a result, we had a kind of one-sided conversation. And I guess there are cultural differences around what you feel comfortable with. But how can we use questions to tune in without sounding like we're sort of, critiquing people in some way?
Yeah, first I saw in the chat a long time ago, somebody said, it's not just about our words, it's also about kind of our tone of voice, our energy, a lot of that. And I think that's part of how to ask questions, right? If I'm like, so Mark, were you wanting this? They're going to feel a little bit put off and it's not going to actually land really well. But if you get a sense of my genuine curiosity about you, and that I'm also taking ownership of why I'm asking the question. I'm letting you know, um, I'm really wanting to understand what's important to you in this moment. And I think I have a sense of it. Is this what's going on for you? That's such an invitation to people. It's like, I get you're really doing this to understand me, and I don't feel put on the spot. Sometimes when people are learning this, they'll just say, "What are you needing?" I mean, don't ask that question. Don't ask that question at all, because most people don't actually always know what they're needing.
Yeah.
Take the vulnerability out of that question and make a guess. Like, I just want to check and see if I understand that this is what's important to you. And then they can tell you yes or no. And as they're saying no, they might say, no, it's not that, but it's this. And all of a sudden, you're in dialogue. It's no longer this questioning kind of energy.
That's interesting. So actually almost having a guess at what you think's going on for them in order to allow them to
Right.
be better able to express it. That's very helpful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, there's a sort of different angle on this here, which instead of sort of focusing on your own needs and not being able to see other people's, there's the feeling that I can't see the name of this question on the chat, but they say, how does people pleasing keep us from expressing our own needs? A lot of us are kind of
Yeah.
wanting to please others and therefore perhaps suppressing our inner feelings about what we really want and need.
Absolutely. And it's recognizing that, right? So if I notice, if I'm really checking in with myself, why am I saying yes to this thing? Or why am I asking this? Or why am I holding back? Then I can say, oh, it's because I'm really afraid about damaging our relationship. I'm really afraid the person will dislike me. And then I can choose to talk about that. I don't have to talk about the original content anymore. I can actually quite vulnerably say, I'm a little worried that if I were to do this, that it would damage our relationship, or that you might no longer trust that I care about you. And I want to see if that's coming up for you. Or, this relationship matters so much to me that I notice that I'm forgetting to stand up for what I'm wanting or to ask for what I'm wanting because I'm afraid of losing the relationship. And I'm curious, how do we want to hold this? What kind of relationship do we want to have together? Right?
Mm,
So have some of those conversations with the people in your life.
yeah, that's
And
very
then
wise.
I'll add one more thing.
Yeah.
If I can actually have the conversation, I get to ask them, when you don't trust that I'm really speaking my authentic experience, one of the ways you can support me is to remind me that you actually feel more trust in our relationship when I show up, and then to show up and listen, right? To show up and listen, not to use that as a way to get information that will be used against me.
Mm.
So
Very good. Um, I'm grateful for everyone who's putting these lovely comments in the chat. Holly said, this has been so helpful and I'll take a lot away from this talk. I always come away from these talks feeling invigorated. So thank you, Holly, and many others. There's another question, again, anonymous, that I think is really topical right now. Lots of us are dealing with having a disagreement on whether it's a political or cultural thing with loved ones. This person said, my brother's a vehement COVID denier who's getting caught up in all sorts of conspiracy theories. I think it's quite dangerous and I'm finding it really hard to stop our relationship falling apart over it. Any advice would be much appreciated.
oh, this is such a heartbreaking one, right?
Yeah.
Because part of what's happening is that folks are accessing different sources of information. So when I think about this brother-in-law, he's probably reading and trusting sources that I wouldn't hold as valid. What's important to me there is that I don't need to convince him about whether or not COVID is real. What I can say is we clearly have a different opinion about this, and I want to be able to take the steps that I think are necessary to protect me and my family, and to have you do the same. And so, given our different perspectives, how can we agree on how we relate to each other? Are you willing to put on a mask when you come to visit my family? Are you willing to let me know if you've been at a rally before we're supposed to have a get together so I can choose whether or not I want to be there? And it's not about arguing about whether or not it's real. It's around honoring each of our capacity to have autonomy over our choices. Are you willing to support that, whether or not we believe it's real? And so change the dialogue a little bit around what do I need to do to keep myself safe rather than insisting that it's about getting my brother-in-law to change their beliefs.
Yes, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Someone's asked a follow-up question to the conversation we were having about Black Lives Matter and sort of racial injustice. How can you speak to someone about this, well, to a non-Black person who doesn't think this is an issue and responds with all lives matter, or I've gone through it too and I'm a white person, or just fails to kind of connect with the severity and realness of this issue? Have you got any advice for how to do that
Yeah.
using NVC principles?
So a couple of things. If you're a white person speaking to another white person about this, I would say thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We need the allies to do this work so that it's not the responsibility of Black people to have these conversations. And one of the ways that you can do that is to understand what's important to them in that. Why are they going to All Lives Matter? If you've got the spaciousness to really help somebody connect to what needs are driving that expression, you might be able to show them how Black Lives Matter is not actually contradictory to them getting those needs met. So I know a lot of people have said, I want some recognition that I grew up poor. I didn't have resources. I didn't even have running water in my house. And I can say, absolutely, that's true. And that should not happen to anybody. And I want to change what's happening for folks, anyone who's poor. And I also want to change what's happening for an entire population where this happens at a higher rate. So how could we do both? Right? But it's really understanding and reflecting back the concerns that they're trying to attend. But this is the work of white folks.
Thank you, Roxy. We're rapidly running out of time. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I just saw one question from a while back, I think from
Yeah.
Natasha, that I wanted to quickly speak, which is how do we do this with our children, right? How do we teach our children this? And I think it's so important that the way you teach your children this is that you treat them as people, not as children, but as people with needs. And that even when their needs seem completely irrelevant and trivial, like a kid might have a need for fun and for play, take that seriously. Take it as seriously as your need around how to get to work on time, and invite them into a dialogue with you. I really want you to play, and I'm really concerned about getting to work on time and earning enough money for our family. What do you suggest we do? Is there something that you think will let us do both? And have them be part of that conversation with you. You'd be surprised at how often children will show up and take that seriously and come up with amazing strategies.
Probably a much wiser answer than I would come up with myself, I'm sure. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Oh, Roxy, this has been such a wonderful conversation, and I'm echoing. I'd like to echo some of the things people have been saying in the chat. So Henry says this has been one of the best Action for Happiness Zooms, brilliant. And Deirdre says Roxy makes it sound so straightforward and simple. She is awesome, and I would certainly echo that. It's been really, really enlightening to hear from you. I feel like I'd love to continue this conversation for hours, and I think you've given us just a taste, but a really important and usable taste of how we can bring NVC ideas into our personal lives, our relationships, our approach to systemic issues, everything actually about our interaction with each other as human beings. So I'm very grateful for your time and expertise this evening. We'll send a follow-up email tomorrow with people where people can sort of get a link to find out more about your work and to follow you. And I think there's something you wanted to share with the audience as well. So we'll make sure that goes out. Did you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I'll just invite folks, especially those new to NVC, that if you'd love to learn more about it, I'm part of an organization called NVC Academy, and they're having a big festival where there'll be a number of trainers talking about bringing NVC into different areas of life. So look at that link tomorrow if you'd like to join us.
Thank you. So, folks, I just wanted to say a big thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening. It's been lovely to have so many of you involved, all these lovely comments and questions. Roxy, would you like to leave us with one final thought about deeper connections and harmonious relationships?
Take care of yourselves as the foundation for being able to take care of those around you. Connect to what's important to you.
Well said. So grateful for your time and wisdom, and keep up the inspiring work. And we'll hopefully see you again very soon. Thanks, Roxy.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me.